Hi, I'm Rob from drumsataword.com, and by the end of this video I hope to have you reading and understanding the basics of written music, specifically for the drums. You have to forgive me though, as I will be reading from a script throughout this video, as I really wanted to make sure I got the words just right for you. So let's crack on. Okay, so these 5 horizontal lines are called the stave. It's a stupid name, I know, but think of it as a frame upon which we can hang our music notes on. Each line represents a different drum or cymbal on the drum kit. Just like for written guitar music, each line represents a different string. The stave is divided up into boxes called bars or measures. This is an empty bar of music. Our music notes will be written in later. Each bar of music represents a certain number of counted beats in a song. So the longer or more counted beats a bar has, the more music notes can be written inside it. Cool so far? Don't worry if not, I'm just getting the boring details out the way first. It all comes together later in this video, promise. Okay, let's talk next about how written bars and measures relate to the music we actually listen to. Most music in the world, and especially the West, can be felt or counted using groups of 4 beats. It's just a nice round number that feels good to dance to. This is why drummers count most songs in with a 4 count. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4. Classic, right? This is also why most music is written down into bars that contain 4 counted beats each. Here we have what is called the time signature. It tells the reader the number of counted beats in a bar. This particular and very common time signature is written at the beginning of bars that contain 4 counted beats in total. Because of this, it is also frequently referred to as common time or 4/4. There are other time signatures used to represent different lengths of bars, but we don't have to worry about those yet. For now, we're just going to focus on bars of common time or 4 counted beats. As we just established, most music is written down into bars that contain 4 counted beats each. So it therefore makes sense that notes be given names based on how many can fit into a bar of common time. Let me show you what I mean. This note is called the quarter note. And as the name suggests, each quarter note takes up a quarter of the bar. In other words, you can fit up to 4 quarter notes into one bar of common time, as shown here. This bar has now been filled up with music notes and so cannot contain any more. You may have noticed that each quarter note represents a single counted beat of the bar. This is important to remember because for written music, the quarter note is commonly used to represent each counted beat. Think of it this way, a quarter note is equal to 1 beat of the bar. I also like to refer to each beat as the downbeat. For example, the quarter notes in this bar fall on the downbeats of beats 1, 2, 3 and 4. Confusingly, or rather sensibly depending on how you want to look at it, music notes retain their name no matter how many counted beats a bar might have. So, for example, this bar of music contains, say, 6 counted beats and so can hold up to 6 quarter notes. Even though each quarter note no longer strictly represents a quarter of the bar, we still refer to them as quarter notes. This helps to keep things nice and simple, as you can probably imagine. Before we move on to some actual playing examples, let me first just quickly tell you about the different parts of the note and their position on the stave. This part of the note is called the note head, and this part of the note is called the stem. The stem of the note can point up or down and makes no difference to the way the note is counted or played. It's simply a choice made by the writer depending on what's easier to read or write. As I mentioned earlier, each line and space on the stave represents a different part of the drum kit. So a note placed here, for example, will be played on the bass drum. Here would be for the floor tom. The snare drum would fall here. Notice that the medium tom is written on the actual line itself here, and the high tom is written here. Now cymbals and hi-hats are also given their own position on the stave, but for clarity of reading they use the X note head instead of the round note head. Again, the note head makes no difference to the way it's counted, it's still called a quarter note and played as such. Different drummers sometimes write cymbals in different positions on the stave, but for 99% of written music, the hi-hat sits on this top line here. The right cymbal tends to be mostly written just below the hi-hat here, but you might also sometimes see it written up here. The crash cymbal can be written on any of these upper lines depending on how many cymbals you want to include, but is commonly written here. Most written music will include a key telling the reader the positions of the drums and cymbals on the stave. If not, then it's usually pretty easy to work out just by reading a bit of it, so don't worry. Also notice how the drums and cymbals on the stave are written in roughly the same order as they appear on an actual drum kit from top to bottom. A rough rule of thumb is that the higher the pitch of the drum or cymbal, the higher the position of the note on the stave, from a low-pitched bass drum to a high-pitched crash cymbal. Okay, so music notes are read from left to right, just like reading a book. The first note of the bar always falls on beat 1, which in this example happens to be a quarter note. You can see that the two notes falling on the bass drum and hi-hat here have been joined together vertically by a single note stem. This means that both the bass drum and the hi-hat are played at the same time as each other. Because beat 1 of the bar contains a quarter note, and a quarter note takes up one whole counted beat of the bar, the next note automatically falls on beat 2. The two notes joined vertically on beat 2 here, and so also played at the same time as each other, are played together on the snare drum and hi-hat. Beat 3 falls a quarter note later and is played on both the bass drum and the hi-hat at the same time. Finally, the snare drum and hi-hat are played together on beat 4. The bar has now been filled up with music notes and so cannot contain any more. Here's what this drum beat sounds like when played and counted out loud on the drum kit. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The second note I want to introduce you to is called the eighth note, and as the name also suggests, you can fit 8 eighth notes into a bar of common time. In other words, each counted beat of the bar is equal to 2 eighth notes. Or, to think of it another way, 1 quarter note takes up the same space in the bar as 2 eighth notes. This means that if the quarter notes are being played at this speed, 1, 2, 3, 4, then the eighth notes are going to be played twice as fast. Duh, 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 duh. You can play 2 eighth notes in the same space of time as you can play 1 quarter note. Each eighth note is counted on the downbeats of the bar as shown, but the notes that fall in between each downbeat are counted using the word and, represented by the plus sign here. So if me clapping represents the quarter note, then this bar will be counted like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now you may have noticed that each eighth note has a single tail written at the top, a little line going across. Unlike quarter notes, which don't have tails, eighth notes can be joined to each other by their tails, or written on their own like this. It makes no difference to the way the notes are played or counted. They are still eighth notes whether joined up or not. I like to join my eighth notes into groups of 2 like this, so that each counted beat of the bar can be clearly seen. You might also see groups of eighth notes joined into 4s like this. Here is an example of a drum beat written using eighth notes. Just to be sure that we understand each other, let me briefly run you through each beat of the bar again. So, the bass drum and hi-hat are played together on the downbeat of beat 1 here, while this eighth note is played on its own on the hi-hat on the and of beat 1. The downbeat of beat 2 is the same as beat 1, except that the snare drum and hi-hat are played together instead. And again the hi-hat is played on its own on the and of beat 2 here. The second half of the bar is exactly the same as the first half, so here's what this drum beat sounds like when played and counted out loud. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Before we move on to the last note type I want to talk about in this video, I want to briefly show you how a bar of music can contain combinations of different notes and therefore create more interesting rhythms. For example, here is a bar containing a mix of both eighth notes and quarter notes. The first two counted beats of the bar have been filled with quarter notes. This quarter note falls on beat 1, and so this one falls a quarter note later on beat 2. The last two counted beats of the bar have been filled with eighth notes. Beat 3 contains 2 eighth notes, and so does beat 4. 4 eighth notes take up the same space in the bar as 2 quarter notes, and so when all the notes are added up, they equal 4 counted beats, therefore the bar has been filled to capacity correctly. Any combination of notes that add correctly can be written and rearranged in any order you like, such as with these examples. Here though is what that first bar sounds like to play and count out loud. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So can you guess how many 16th notes fit into a bar of common time? Drum roll please. Yeah, you guessed it, 16. In other words, one beat of the bar can be filled up with 4 16th notes, or that 1 quarter note is equal in length to 4 16th notes. At this point, notice how the 3 note types we've looked at so far relate to each other. 1 quarter note is equal to 2 eighth notes, which is then also equal to 4 16th notes. The number of notes that fit into a beat of the bar doubles as you move through the note types. So going back to our example, we still count eighth notes on 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, but the extra note in between is counted using the words E and represented with the letters E and A. So if me clapping represents the quarter notes, then a whole bar of 16th notes would be counted like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 E yander, 2 E yander, 3 E yander, 4 E yander, 1 E yander, 2 E yander, 3 E yander, 4 E yander. At first you might feel like a bit of an idiot counting all this 1 E yander stuff out loud, but counting out loud really helps to internalise the rhythms when first starting to read. It certainly worked for me anyway. Now, notice that 16th notes have 2 tails. So just as the number of notes per beat double, so an extra tail is also added to the note, from no tails on the quarter note, to 1 tail on the 8th note, to 2 tails on the 16th note. Makes sense, right? And just like any other note with a tail, 16th notes can also be joined together, or written on their own like this. Again, it makes no difference to the way they're played or counted, they're all still 16th notes whether joined by their tails or not. Most drummers, including myself, like to group 16th notes into blocks of 4, like this, so that each beat of the bar can be clearly seen. This is an example of a drum beat written in 16th notes. Beat 1 contains 4 16th notes on the hi-hat and 1 on the bass drum, played at the same time as the hi-hat on the downbeat of beat 1. Beat 2 is the same, except that the snare drum is played on the downbeat with the hi-hat instead of the bass drum. The second half of the bar is the same as the first, so let's now hear what this drum beat sounds like when played and counted out loud. 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1. In this section, I want to hopefully explain to you the rather mysterious world of joining different note types together with their tails and why this is done. This really freaks out a lot of people, but I will do my best to explain it as clearly as possible, hopefully. In our first example, you can see that the bar contains 4 groups of 1 8th note and 2 16th notes joined by their tails. I've purposely joined them in this way so that each grouping represents a single beat of the bar. It just makes it easier to read this way. Let's take a closer look at beat 1 first. You can see that the first note of the grouping has one tail and so therefore is an 8th note, while the next two notes have two tails, making them 16th notes. We've done that already, pretty obvious. Notice also that a single tail has been used to join the 8th note to the two 16th notes. If two tails were used to join all three notes together, then the 8th note would become a 16th note like this, and therefore the rhythm would change. To see how the rhythm would change, let's first go back to the way it was first written. So as usual, reading from left to right, the first note we encounter is played on the downbeat of beat 1. Because this note is an 8th note and takes up the same space in the bar as two 16th notes, the E of beat 1 is skipped over. In other words, the 8th note takes up the space of both the downbeat of beat 1 and the E of beat 1. This means that the next note must fall on the and. Now, because this note is a 16th, the next note must fall a 16th note later on the of beat 1, which it does. But the last note of the grouping is also a 16th, so the next note falls a 16th note later, which happens to be the next beat of the bar. So, looking at the whole bar again, we play on each downbeat, skip the E, and play on both the and the like this. 1 E, and 2 E, and 3 E, and 4 E, and 1 E, and 2 E, and 3 E, and 4 E, and Now, if we were to join all three notes together with two tails like this, then the first note now becomes a 16th note, and so the second note must then fall a 16th note later on the E of beat 1, instead of skipping it and playing it on the and as we had previously. It becomes this: 1 E and 1 E and not 1 E and 1 E and Notice that I still counted the E in that last example, even though nothing was actually played on it. You don't have to count all of the 16th notes out loud, but I find that by doing so helps you to leave the correct amount of space between the notes. Now, I'm purposely avoiding what are called rests. Now, rests are used to fill up parts of the bar where you don't want to play anything, and are very useful, for example, when writing complicated rhythms where lots of 16th notes are being skipped over. I didn't want this video to get any more complicated at this stage, and so rests will be best explained in another video. For now, you just need to be aware that they exist and that there is another way to fill up spaces in the bar other than changing and using notes of varying lengths. I hope that makes sense and that I haven't freaked you out too much. Okay, let's move on. In this next example, we have two 16th notes tied to one 8th note in each beat of the bar. Briefly then, if we look at just beat 1 again, the first note falls on the downbeat. Because this note is a 16th, the next note must fall a 16th note later on the E, which also happens to be a 16th note, which means that this 8th note must fall on the and because it's an 8th note, it takes up the space of two 16th notes, meaning that nothing is played on the So the whole bar will be played like this: 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and So, as a summary, and as a way to hopefully bring this all together for you, I want to give you some final examples containing everything we've looked at so far today. So, in our first example, beat 1 contains a quarter note, beat 2 contains two 8th notes, and beats 3 and 4 contain 4 16th notes each. Hopefully you can now clearly see where each beat of the bar falls, thanks to grouping notes together with their tails. Here's what the bar sounds like played and counted out loud. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 E and 4 E and 1 and 2 and 3 E and 4 E and 1 and 2 and 3 E and 4 E and 1 and 2 and 3 E and 4 E and 1. In our next example, beat 1 contains two 8th notes, beats 2 and 3 contain two 16th notes joined to an 8th note, and beat 4 is filled with an 8th note joined to 2 16th notes. And here's what this bar sounds like. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1. And finally, for our last example, beat 1 contains 2 16th notes joined to an 8th note. Beat 2 contains an 8th note joined to 2 16th notes. Beat 3 is simply filled with 2 8th notes. And beat 4 contains 4 16th notes. So this bar is played and counted like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1. Well, I hope you found this video helpful. I didn't want to swamp you with all aspects of reading in one go, and so therefore there are subjects that I had to skip over for now, such as triplets, dotted notes, and as we previously discussed, rests. But don't worry, these other aspects of reading will be much easier to understand once you've mastered the basics. Trust me on this. At first it can all seem a bit confusing and mysterious, but one day there will be a eureka moment when all of a sudden it just clicks and makes sense. Well, this is what happened to me anyway. The most useful skill I ever gained for my drumming was the ability to read music. And I'm not just saying that for the sake of this video, I really mean it, honestly I do. Imagine being able to write down, read and understand every piece of drumming music ever written. Just think of the possibilities. Seriously, think of the possibilities. So good luck with your reading, and I promise you, once you've learned how to read music, you'll be amazed at all the cool stuff that suddenly becomes available to you. Think of all those books that you can go out and buy and read from, for example. So until next time, happy drumming to you.